The Juneau World Affairs Council presents the success of British Columbia's carbon tax and what it means for Alaska with Owen Madden. Madden grew up and practiced law in Ireland but switched careers after studying climate change for a postgraduate degree. Now Madden lives in British Columbia and works for the Wilderness Committee, a Canadian environmental nonprofit.
Hello, thank you for coming tonight. It's a real honor to be here, to have come to Juneau to speak to people about climate change. It's an even bigger honor to have made it to Juneau in time to eat some Silver Bowl bagels, which I'm told may not be around all that long. There is a potato on the screen right now, and I'm going to explain what that's about. Like every journey of discovery and career change, mine did start with the common Irish potato, believe it or not. In 2005, I was a corporate lawyer for a diamond company. We patented the drilling bits, the diamond drilling bits that are necessary for fracking and oil and gas extraction in general. And my time there was a little bit strained because I always felt that there was something amiss, something wrong with in the wider world. And one Saturday, I happened to just go along to a farmer's market in the town I worked in Limerick, and had been a little bit sort of antisocial up until that point, and said, let's have a conversation with their potato farmer, the guy I get my potatoes from. I said, how are you and how's life on the farm? And his reply sort of astonished me. He said, well, the weirdest thing's been happening on my farm. My father planted seed potatoes at the same time every single year. I have done so myself. But in the last number of years, the seasons are changing in my fields, and I'm finding it harder and harder to actually plant my seed potatoes each year. And he said it was happening so quick that it was confusing himself and nature itself. And actually climate change had arrived, climate impacts had arrived to Ireland. I hadn't the terminology to describe what I was hearing from this farmer, but I did sort of study up a little bit on the changes that were being experienced, and found out things like, to maintain a safe climate, we need to stay at 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. At that time, we were at 380. Currently, we're sitting on 400. And for a stable, livable climate, we need to try and stabilize the changes that we're causing in the climate to about 2 degrees of warming. So it presented to me a lot of work. It also became clear through learning about the challenge that we had that there was what's called a carbon budget. How much carbon, whether it's methane or carbon dioxide, we could put into the atmosphere before we went beyond that 2 degree warming threshold. And the challenging news from that is that about 2/3 of all the fossil fuel reserves that are known across the world right now, including in Alaska, need to stay in the ground. Now, the majority of that will be coal. Some of that will be oil, 1/3 to 1/2, and slightly less of that will be gas, given the fact that each one has a bigger or lesser impact on the climate. But it's still to be said that to maintain a stable, livable climate, warming above 2 degrees is not feasible. And I do work for an environmental organization in Vancouver, but it's really my nieces and nephews that I report to. And it's really whether or not I can look them in the eye and said, I did all I could to hand you a stable, livable climate that I've benefited from. That's what drives me. And that's what my true career is, and they're my true bosses. And they're pretty strict. They're kind of hard to answer to sometimes, but we're working on it. This isn't going to be a very downbeat or sad sort of talk, because I know the challenge we're facing. I believe any challenge that we face is an opportunity to grow. I actually believe that we will deal with climate change as a species, and that we'll grow through that process, and what will emerge the other side of that will be a far better society to live in. But it starts here, and it starts with talking about the solutions to it. So why climate change? Since those days when I was learning about the climate impacts in Ireland, it actually hasn't really changed all that much. Everywhere I go, we seem to be suffering more and more climate impacts. I'll never forget the experience walking through the streets of Vancouver this summer and breathing in the smoky air from the forest fires surrounding the city. And we actually had to stay in for a number of days because of the pollution in the air from forest fires. And that story is reflected here in in Alaska. In fact, for many nations and areas outside of Alaska, Alaska is the poster child for climate impacts. This year, 5 million acres of forests have been burned. It's a rapid increase in forest fires. The whole state is sitting on 80% of the land underneath this is permafrost. So as that begins to warm up and as the ground becomes softer, the cost of having to relocate all of that infrastructure that's below ground increases. And of course, there is the poster child for climate change is no longer that polar bear on a piece of ice, which I'm really sorry, but it didn't really inspire me. People and communities inspire me, and that community is Kivalina on the west coast of Alaska. It's one of 160 rural communities threatened by climate change, and it costs about $80 to $100 million to relocate a lot of these communities. And there's a strong argument to say that there's a legal requirement to do so. It's very expensive. Climate change is very expensive. Denying the realities of climate change is incredibly expensive. There's $1 billion price tag on every Democrat or Republican or whatever representative out there who denies the need for climate action. That's an expensive business. Luckily enough, though, we're in a corner of the world where to talk about these issues and to take action on these issues could not be any more powerful. We're sitting in a place where so much coal, gas, and oil is about to pass through here, and very little people know that. I work on a campaign to try and keep oil, gas, and coal out of the Salish Sea, or else to at least get the realities of climate change through to the people who are making the decisions on those projects. The most famous climate fight in the United States right now is the Keystone XL pipeline. That's worth about 150 million tons of carbon and has rightly been confronted by environmentalists who said we cannot afford to build this project. Well, the Salish Sea off the west coast of Vancouver has twice that much carbon about to pass through it if they were to build all those terminals down there in Vancouver. And I've spent the last number of years fighting hard to bring that reality true. If we build all the coal, gas, and oil projects in British Columbia, we are facing 300 million tons of climate-changing gases when in British Columbia, for instance, the whole province currently produces about 60. So it's a giant contribution to this challenge. Like I said, I don't want to dwell too much on the consequences of inaction and try and get to what we're actually for. And the wonderful thing about being a carbon pricing campaigner now and working on carbon pricing is that I get to talk about what I'm for. I'm for a more equal society. For instance, in BC, where I live right now, 20% of youth live in poverty. I honestly believe if we are to do what's necessary on climate change, we're going to create a much more equal society. Part of that is what I call the democratization of energy. A big piece of this is actually that at the community level, at the household level, we're all going to be generating our own energy through wind, through solar, through tidal generation, which is really an opportunity for Alaska like nowhere else. Countries like Ireland, the Bay of Fundy in Canada have been experimenting with generating power from tidal flows. Bizarrely, the one in the Bay of Fundy, the tidal flow was so powerful it actually shredded the generator that was in there. Now that's not a sign that we shouldn't keep going and keep trying to harness the tide. It says that there's a lot of energy and a lot of power there. And for me, if Alaskans are capable, back in the 60s and 70s, of building oil terminals and pipelines across this state in the Arctic Circle, then they could lead the world in the same engineering capabilities, showing us what can be done with tidal energy, solar energy, geothermal, you name it. We need that Alaskan engineering ability. The fight for these new fossil fuel projects to be either stopped or at least a decent conversation around whether or not we can afford to have them and deal with the climate impacts of those pipelines. And the real well-known fight is the Keystone XL pipeline fight. It has opened up a brand new space, and that space is what I call the climate solution space. I believe more and more people are coming to a point where they're saying, I get it, Owen, you're on one side, the oil, gas, and coal companies are on the other side, you've all been fighting, what's the solution? Okay, I want to know what the solution is. Make it easy to understand and make it something that I can play a role in. And I believe carbon pricing, the campaigns to get state level prices on carbon is where we could all start. It can really be an engine to a cleaner world, a shift away from being dependent on oil, gas, and coal, and to that place where there's zero carbon. As you can tell, I talk a lot. I was born with the gift of the gab. I'm going to try and keep this to 30 or 40 minutes, and there'll be at least 20 minutes of questions and answers. So if I'm saying anything that you want to record and ask me about, write it down, and we'll hopefully get it done in 20 minutes. One last point. I mentioned the fact that we're trying to stop 2 degrees or beyond warming. Actually, Alaska's winter temperatures have already risen by 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit. In summer, it's about 3.4 degrees Fahrenheit. So Alaska has seen the fastest rates of warming than anywhere, pretty much, other than right up in the Arctic Circle. So, and that's what the slide shows, basically. The impacts are what's driving me, but also the opportunity that is represented by climate change. So this is and any of these presentations I put up here, images I put up here, are by organizations that are happy to share them. And this is Sightlines Institute. They've developed this great map from down in, they're from Seattle, and it's a map of basically everywhere in the world who has taken the effort to price carbon, who have stepped into this climate solution space and said, we're going to generate a revenue stream just by changing market behavior, just by changing people's usage of fossil fuels, and we're going to use that revenue in a number of different ways. There's actually 39 different jurisdictions across the world that have priced carbon, and China's coming along very quickly. China's already experimenting with localized pricing schemes. We expect a national pricing scheme to come out of China next year. When it does, over a quarter of all of the greenhouse gas emissions that are being put out there will be priced at some level. And the prices vary. It's well over $150 in some parts of Scandinavia. Currently, it's traded in places like California and Quebec and Ontario. The price there is hovering around $13 for the permit to emit a ton of climate changing gases. And there's also a regional approach in many different places. Out on the east coast of the United States, there's something called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. That has a whole bunch of different states, 9 of all, who are working together. It's Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, Rhode Island, and Vermont. They've all capped their emissions from the power sector, and they're trading them. So what we've learned is that it's taking off globally. And although at a national level, it has proven hard in some places in the US, for instance, to price carbon, states are taking the initiative. And in very many cases, they're trading with each other. So they're setting up their own trading blocks. It's not a silver bullet. So carbon pricing, for instance, will not allow you to grow your fossil fuel industry. And I'll show why that is a lesson that I've taken from British Columbia's recent past. It's not a case of, well, we'll grow our oil industry and we'll pay the tax and therefore no one can say anything to us because we're doing what's right. It doesn't work that way. For me, carbon pricing is actually the best way to get through that transition away from being based on fossil fuels. The argument as to whether or not it's safe to run an economy into the future based on oil, gas, and coal, for me, is done. Unfortunately, we're at that point now where the world is realizing it needs to get off of those products. And the best thing that any region can do is to set itself up for a transition that provides the revenue stream necessary to make those changes and does it as quickly as it can. Regulations have been good. It's been good that people have tried with regulations. They have been, in my opinion, not quite up to the challenge. So they've done some things like clean fuels directives are great. The fact that our efficient cars are getting even more efficient is great. But it hasn't gotten to the point where we have a regulation, say the Kyoto Protocol, whatever it is, that sorts the issue out globally. I believe a global price on carbon, and I have an idea of how we can get there, will really help us get that full suite of carbon solutions on the table. Economists say it's the most efficient way of reducing greenhouse gases because it basically just sends a market signal. You can put a price or a fee. I like to say tax, but sometimes the word tax is a dirty word. So I'll say fee or price on activities that you don't want, polluting, for instance. And then you generate a revenue stream which help with things that you might want, like income or paying for health services. Or in your case, in Alaska, providing a climate impact fund to deal with the incredible costs of climate change that are already here and will continue into the future, such as relocations. The world is sort of waking up to that, and there's the next big conversation about the world's regulation on climate change, the replacement for Kyoto, is happening in Paris in November. And increasingly, carbon pricing is feeding into the messaging there, or the goal there. It may well end up that all of the participants actually just knuckle down on what is the price for carbon across the world, because we've been doing this for so long and we're not at the point where we need to be. So with that impatience just comes a focus, and it is incredibly geared towards carbon pricing now like never before. It has bipartisan support too. If I say create big government regulations on climate change, I switch off maybe half this room and probably half the audience, because big government is something a lot of people don't want. Depending on how you actually price carbon, you can have as big or as small a government involvement as you like. In the case of British Columbia, they decided to actually have no government involvement and return all of the revenue back to people or corporations. So you can actually set up no revenue stream, and that's called revenue neutral taxes. So you tax something, but you don't create a revenue stream for the government, you hand it back. And I'll get into that a little bit when I talk about what the BC carbon tax design is. Now, as I said, tax is a word that sends a shiver down some people's spine. So the word used to describe that is actually a fee and dividend system, because it's not like a normal tax. You know, most of the time when you pay a tax, it goes to the government. You have to trust them to do whatever they do with that, and you hope for the best. A fee and dividend is a question of putting a price on carbon, but actually returning that price to everyone in the shape of what you guys get is a dividend each year anyway. So you know what a dividend looks like, and it comes from the permanent fund. Well, that's the idea behind some forms of carbon pricing. The fact that it has bipartisan support is interesting when you see the oil industry's support for pricing carbon. And they're probably the last persons or groups you'd expect that from. In Alberta this spring, there was an election for, well, what some people say is a left-leaning or slightly socialist type of government. Take it or leave it, whatever you like, whatever you don't like. The reaction of the oil industry was really interesting. Suncor, which is one of Alberta's big two oil producers, came out and said, we want a broad-based carbon tax. They want clarity. They don't want a whole mishmash of different prices on carbon across North America. And increasingly, the oil majors are coming out and supporting carbon taxes. In fact, there's a letter that just went into the United Nations from the big European oil majors. And what's interesting about Alaska's production is that it's BP and Shell that are here. BP and Shell, along with Statoil, Total, BG, which is a big gas producer, and Eni, which is an Italian producer, they've just sent in a letter to the United Nations saying they're ready to do their part. They want new pricing systems on carbon incorporated globally, and they want an international framework to connect those national systems. So it's interesting to know that the policy being driven for the oil majors in Alaska is coming from European headquarters. And their perspective is, no, a global carbon price is good. We don't want to have to deal with a $13 price in California and a $30 price in British Columbia and this mishmash of different systems where we're capping and trading in some place. They just want clarity. And I believe that's part of the reason why they support the push towards a carbon price. Lastly, the interesting point on this is why carbon pricing is important right now is very much due to President Obama's Clean Power Plan. So this year, very positive, very ambitious targets were set down for how the United States generates energy. The idea is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 32% from 2005 levels by 2030. And it applies to how every state powers itself up, some power by coal. In the case of Alaska, it's about 50% from gas. A lot of the remainder is from diesel fuel, which is expensive. And then the remainder is a mixture of hydro and wind. Unfortunately, Alaska is not part of the Clean Power Plan. And the reason it was exempted, I'm told, is because there wasn't enough clear information from the state to be able to bring it underneath the CPP. And maybe people have more information. I couldn't find any reference to Alaska within it. So Alaska is exempt. However, it still applies in a roundabout way to us and to you. And that's because there's two options with the Clean Power Plan. You can go about changing how your energy goes into those power plants in whatever way you want, or you can price the energy going into those power plants. That is an indication from the US government that it's giving states and at state level action the power to price carbon. And eventually it hopes that with all these mishmash different prices, there'll be a will there to set a national price. There has been efforts in the past to create a cap and trade and carbon pricing scheme. In the US, it failed in Congress. It seems more so now that there's a willingness to go to the state level, and states are taking action. There are burgeoning campaigns now to price carbon in Washington and in Oregon. There is already a scheme in California, and there's a scheme in British Columbia. Pretty soon, Alaska will be the last West Coast jurisdiction without a price on carbon. So I arrived into British Columbia in 2011, and within the first couple of weeks of my new job, I got a check from the government. I've never gotten a check from the government before, especially one that I didn't really know very well or hadn't paid much taxes to. And it was called the carbon tax credit check that I was getting as a low-income earner. And that was the first realization that something different was happening in British Columbia to anywhere else I lived. And really, there was a carbon tax. I didn't know it existed. It is much more of a fee and dividend type of thing, in the sense that it's not generating a revenue stream for the government, and it's being returned straight back. I will admit, however, that my check was nothing compared to the $1,884 that each of you got from the Alaskan Permanent Fund dividend, but it was still interesting. So it made me think, well, where did this check come from? And it came from the actions of a few people back in 2008. Carol Taylor, sorry, I'm supposed to point to this screen. Carol Taylor, who was the Minister for Finance at the time in BC, the Premier of British Columbia, Gordon Campbell, and to a lesser degree, but still influential, the Governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who at the time was a real climate champion and may have actually just scared Gordon Campbell into doing the right thing. Who knows? I certainly would have not taken him on if he told me to do it. But at the time in 2008, Al Gore was at its best, and he was really raising the issue of climate change, amongst other initiatives, but Al Gore did really help. It was before the time when we had what I call a denial pushback, which was a very well-funded campaign to sow the seeds of doubt in the mass public that we as a species are causing runaway climate change, and we are. And it was a very, very well deployed scheme to confuse us all, and the rates at which people cared about and understood and wanted action on climate change dropped because of it. But thankfully, these folks were around before all that happened, and they were listening to Al Gore, and they brought about a fee and dividend scheme, which I'll get more into the specifics in a second on the design that they adopted. But it is interesting to look back in 2008 and find out what was going on politically for these players that made this thing happen, and it was very progressive. Thankfully, Carol Taylor, who really led the process with our Premier in BC, has been interviewed this year and last year, and has sort of come out with some amazing quotes to sort of describe how she was thinking at the time. One of the things that she sort of spelled out for us was this issue of exceptions. So you can already hear it, right? If we're going to price carbon in Alaska, there's all those oil lobbyists, and they're going to be straight in the door, and they're going to be saying, well, you can't put a price on what we do. We'll go and we'll produce oil somewhere else, and it's going to be uncompetitive for us, and it's going to cause havoc for the economy. And the same thing happened in BC. And Carol Taylor's quote is saying, I did feel very strongly that we couldn't make any exceptions. Couldn't exempt any particular industries. If we made one, we'd make all kinds of them. And at that point, your model falls apart. The whole scheme falls apart. If you have to make exceptions for everyone, what's the point? So what took a lot of political energy within government was saying no exceptions. Okay, so that's interesting to know. The other thing that was interesting is how the populace dealt with this new tax. And she said, well, after it made its way through the first year and the first election, people just didn't talk about it anymore. And she said, because that increase was written into legislation, the increase being that the carbon tax came in at $10, but it increased every single year. And I'll tell you a bit more about that. But the point was, no one really asked about it anymore. And because the increases were written into legislation, it just happened without public debate. She said it wasn't a constant public debate. She said, now that it's established and it's been around for a long time, it's absolutely legitimate to talk about whether or not it should be used for transit or for other things. And that wouldn't have worked at first. The decision at first in 2008 was to return all of the revenue to people in the shape of low-income tax breaks, corporate tax breaks, personal tax breaks. And she is reflecting there now what the polling will reflect and what I'll get to in a minute. And that is that British Columbians are not into or supportive of the corporate tax break component of it. They actually want that revenue to be spent on something more tangible for them. Healthcare, building the green economy, shifting over to clean technologies, mass transit, you name it. British Columbia is at that point now. Carol Taylor says they were not in 2008. They could not have gotten support from big business without the corporate tax break component of it. Who knows? I wasn't in BC in 2008. I'm just telling you what she says was going on. But in reality, actually, it was about a personal commitment by Premier Campbell. He handed down orders from the Premier's office and he said, this tax is coming in. We are doing this and we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. And he led it from his office. That's a long-winded way of saying for a carbon fee or price here, and that's the good terminology to use here because less people will rail against it, you need a champion. You need a political champion. You need someone who, like me or like you, or whatever drove you here tonight, cares about future generations and says, you know what, this is going to happen. I'm going to make this happen. You need that and I'd say a strong grassroots campaign behind it to withstand what is definitely going to be a very vocal, non-accurate, I would say sometimes unethical pushback on messaging, seeking to basically discourage everyone from taking that measure and saying that Alaska's economy would be doomed if there was a price on carbon, which I believe it wouldn't be. So you need both of those components. Lucky enough in BC, we had a champion, happened to be the Premier, and was able to go ahead and do it. Nowadays, I believe, for the future of this carbon tax, and there is a future to it, I'll explain to you, we're going to need a grassroots mobilization because unfortunately, it hasn't been treated with as much respect as Premier Campbell has by our current Premier. So the tax design, it is very much a fee and dividend scheme. The red line shows you where income, how much income came in, and the rest, as you can see, sometimes it actually exceeded what was coming in as what was going out. So rather than being revenue neutral, okay, which is the idea of taking in a certain revenue stream from taxes or a fee and giving it all back, in fact, the government in BC was using pricing carbon as a means of actually giving more tax breaks to everybody than what was coming in. It was actually about $400 million more than what was coming in. 1.2 million was being generated in 2013 to 2014. 1.6 million was going out in the shape of tax breaks. So in the year 2013 to 2014, 440 million went to the corporations, which was much bigger than personal income taxes, which were about 237, and low income tax breaks, about 194 million. The price did start at $10 in 2008. That's important because when you're trying to get a price in, my advice is don't come out with where we need to go with pricing, which are some big 3-figure numbers. Start small and make sure your increases, incremental annual increases, are big enough to get you where you need to be pretty quick. So at $10 a fee on a ton of carbon dioxide is not a big deal, and that's where BC started. And it went up 5 years each year until 2012 when it was frozen at $30 a ton. It needs to be unfrozen at that rate. Okay, it's not effective enough. But that was how they designed it. They also combined it with a revenue neutral government requirement, which meant that any of the government entities, schools, whatever it is, that burned energy had to offset that energy elsewhere. In fact, the finance minister is required to take a 15% pay cut if he or she doesn't make it revenue neutral. If it's proven that it wasn't revenue neutral, the Minister for Finance has to actually take a pay cut. They were that adamant about it. Some industrial activities were exempted. So you did have the aluminum industry, the cement and lime producers coming and saying, we can't afford this. At different stages, they have been exempted. And then northern and rural homeowners were seen to be more exposed to it. They got a $200 rebate. Now it's virtually impossible to remove. Think about it. If a premier comes along and says, I don't like the carbon tax, we're taking it away. What people now hear in BC is, I'm increasing personal income taxes and I'm increasing corporation taxes because they all got a massive break because of the carbon tax. It's a funny tax that way. So people love it that way because to take it away would be to take away people's income and make corporations pay more, which makes them arguably uncompetitive. So it's an interesting design and there's pros and cons to it. The pros is certainly over the 4 years that it went up from 2008 to 2012, it did reduce individual per capita use of fossil fuels. That went down 16%. It has a pretty wide range. It does cover about 70% of BC's carbon pollution, although I put that line into the cons, which is the next slide, because it should have 100% coverage. But you know, depending on your outlook, that's a pretty good thing. It was easy to bring in because it piggybacks for people's personal use of fuel. There's only a certain amount of wholesalers in BC who actually sell oil to the retailers who deliver to you at the pump. So I don't have to fill a return to the government and say, this is how much carbon I used this year. It actually, the wholesalers took it on for fossil fuels, and then the big emitters also self-report. So in your case, the big gas-burning power generators, they would self-report. So there's nothing for you to do except receive a dividend or a credit, whatever words they use, depending on your status. It resulted in about 7 cents a litre on gas. So 7 cents on gas per litre, compared to a provincial tax, which can be up to 25 cents, depending on where you're living. Down in Vancouver it is for us. And it has generated $6.1 billion in revenue. If we were to actually get to our 2020 targets, and that's question mark right now, it would generate $8 billion in revenue. A benefit for BC is it's great for our reputation. People know we have this pricing carbon thing. I'm quoting the Premier, Christy Clark, current Premier Christy Clark. She says, we've gained that reputation as a place that's very competitive for business and investment while holding industry to a high environmental standard. I think that's the kind of province that most British Columbians want us to be. She's gone to the World Bank. She's spoken about pricing carbon, how supportive she is of it, and so on. She's really riding on the coattails of Premier Campbell. And it's very popular amongst British Columbians. When it came in for a tax, it got 54% support. It peaked with support after 4 years when it peaked at its price at $30 a tonne. You think that's when people are getting a little less supportive. 64% of people said, yep, we love this tax. This is awesome. Since then, it got frozen. It's down to about 58% support. That's pretty high for a tax. Some of the cons. It's regressive. It was supposed to pretty evenly take care of corporations and take care of lower income households. And lower income households are more at risk than other households. They can less afford to pay the price on carbon than some households. That's not good, and any pricing scheme that comes in should first and foremost compensate low to middle income households, first off, because they aren't creating as much climate change as wealthier households, and they are not generating as much pollution as wealthier households. It's a given, just do it, it's non-negotiable. The other interesting thing about it is the corporate tax component of it has become really unpopular. And what you're looking at are the results of polling where British Columbians were asked, hey, you know, we'll thaw the freeze on the carbon tax. We'll take it from $30 and we'll put those $5 increases on it right now. How would you like us to spend the money? And they said, The big red block there on the far right side is no to corporate tax increases. Sorry, my apologies, increases in corporate tax breaks. So they didn't want the increasing revenue to go to more corporate tax breaks. They wanted to go to things like government priorities, healthcare and education, reducing pollution by bringing in mass transit and energy efficiency. And then they were even more popular than just straight up reducing our own personal income taxes. So that's interesting. People actually said, no, go ahead and spend the money, just spend it on sensible stuff. Or give us a total break from what we give you, but don't give it to corporations. So that's a con, in my opinion. That needs to change. It was only mandated for 4 years. It should have been indefinitely. There should have been $5 increases indefinitely. And because of that, our current premier did freeze it, because we need to get up to figures like $200 a ton on carbon if we're going to get below this 2-degree warming threshold. All right? That's a scary figure. I wouldn't advise anyone in Alaska to start a carbon pricing scheme where you're telling people they're going to be paying $200 a ton on climate change. But we need to get there, and your scheme needs to bring you there. It can be in $10 or $15 increments. You get there pretty quick, but it needs to happen. Income taxes of $1 billion were cut. So you could say, some people say it's a pro, I'd say it's a con, that actually taxpayers ended up ahead of the government. They actually paid less taxes. I came from a place where, money doesn't pay for healthcare unless it comes from taxes. So depending on whether you want government to be making money off taxpayers or not, I think it's a con. They kind of used it as a reason to give more tax breaks. But there you go. And then cement industry folks did complain about it. And they said, well, there's cheaper places for us to make cement. That issue is called competitiveness. And it's about the fear that you're only going to create pollution havens elsewhere if you do the right thing here. And governments and states are coming to terms with that. They're able to put in import-export taxes that can cope with that. And those taxes don't offend World Trade Organization rules. You can actually say to a region, all right, we're putting a price on carbon, but we're going to make you put a price on carbon by putting a tariff on your imports coming in here. And increasingly, the world is going to go that way. Like, there's a political pressure now to do the right thing by climate change, and that's what it's going to look like. So the next steps, this is just some extracts from a recent editorial which I thought was really interesting. Our premier has frozen the carbon tax, and because of that, although I told you about a drop in our carbon pollution up until 2012, those figures have started to rise now. And they're rising because our premier and our government really wants a brand new fossil fuel industry in this era when we're supposed to be getting away from fossil fuels. It's called the LNG industry. And it's already increasing its production, its activity, and therefore our figures are reversing now. So our current premier is not handling the carbon tax like she ought to, and it's being reflected now in our major, and this is a pretty right-leaning newspaper. It says, politically motivated tinkering with BC's carbon tax has chipped away at some of its best features and may well begin to erode its effectiveness. Yet British Columbians increasingly accept it. That says it all. British Columbians love the carbon tax. Our current government are not abiding by it, and they're in some ways even using it for an excuse to build a giant new fossil fuel industry. At the rates that we're trying to build LNG in BC, it's not a transition fuel. It's not going to offset coal, and it's increasing our emissions. It's reversing all of the progress we've made. So needless to say, I spent a lot of time fighting with the gas industry in BC. Alaska. How can we compare what happened in BC to Alaska? Well, if there was a price on carbon in Alaska, there's a few interesting points to make. The first thing is, unlike BC, our energy comes from hydro, so it's not taxable. You can't put a fee on the carbon that's created for our energy. That's not the case here in Alaska. And because more than half of the energy comes from gas, and another big component of it is diesel fuel, that is quite easy to set a fee on. There's a major funding gap due to oil income dropping. So I learned a little bit about this from a guy called Gunnar Knapp, the University of Alaska in Anchorage. And it's because that Trans-Alaska pipeline is carrying about a quarter of the oil it used to. And it peaked in 1988, and it's been dropping ever since. Also what's dropping is the oil price, and that was not expected. So when the Alaskan government sat down and did its additions and subtractions about what it could spend and what it couldn't spend, it didn't and couldn't have foreseen an enormous crash in oil prices. What that means is that in this year, Alaska is going to run up a deficit estimated by Mr. Knapp at the university at about $3.9 billion. So that's for every Alaskan about $5,200. If the prices only rise to $80, he says, next year there'll still be a funding gap of about $2.7 billion. That's because spending is being cut. That's the old dirty A word, austerity, and I hate it. But spending is being cut across the board to try and deal with this funding deficit. The government's hoping for at least $80 a barrel on oil. The one-year forecast from oilprice.net and a lot of other sort of resources online is a lot lower than that. They're talking more like 50 or 60. So there is a funding problem growing in Alaska. The other interesting point is that fuel for transport takes up about half the energy consumption in Alaska. That again is easy enough to trace. There's already a fuel surcharge probably, so it's easy to know what is being used and how to put a fee on that. And we know already that when you put on a fee like we have in British Columbia, it can show up as 6 or 7 cents. It's not a huge amount of money, but it generates a pretty big income. Also, the oil and gas industry is burning a lot of its own oil and gas. Certainly gas is re-injected into oil fields a lot. If you switch to LNG or if you move towards LNG, LNG uses about 20% of its own gas just to liquefy the stuff, to process it and get it offshore. Again, that's easy to trace and it's easy to put a fee on. They all have to report those figures. So a big energy consumer are actually the energy producers of Alaska going forward. And that definitely increases the more LNG is leaned upon. Other points is that the fiscal problem is really described well when you look at how much less revenue there is coming from the oil industry. So as sort of Gunnar Knapp described it, Alaska oil production is falling and our population is rising. It's hard for falling oil production to support most of state government for a growing population. About 90% of the unrestricted spending that can happen in Alaska does come from oil production, but yet it's dropped about 80% from the years leading up to 2012 over a space of 3 or 4 years. The revenue coming in has dropped a lot. So basically, the last point is there's already some very, very low rates of state taxes here in Alaska. It's actually the lowest than anywhere in the United States. For instance, it's about $500 on average per person in Alaska. The US average is about $2,400, and across in Connecticut it's about $4,000. So there's room there for either a tax or a fee, depending on what's politically possible. And then we can't forget about the major climate costs facing Alaska, which grossly outweigh most other regions. When you have to relocate potentially 160 communities, you really can write the book on climate impacts and the cost of climate change. So Alaska has a choice, and there is this pollution haven choice that it can make. So at this crossroads, Alaska could say, okay, well, you know what, we're not going to price carbon. And we're going to be that place that the oil and gas industry produces from, because it's easier to do it here than it is anywhere else, because they're pricing carbon elsewhere, and we'll be the smart guys, and we won't price carbon, and we'll have lots and lots of oil to produce. Well, there's a story that kind of is reflective of this, and that's why I put up the Keystone XL picture. But in the modern age, it's really dangerous to be classed as a climate renegade or someone who's not being responsible on climate change. And it was a status that Alberta was successfully tarnished with by the environmental movement in North America. And it knuckled down on a fight over a bunch of pipelines, 2 of which I've worked on, 1 of which these folks worked on. There's 3 pipelines currently that were supposed to get oil out of Alberta, which have not been constructed. They've not been constructed because of the argument that Alberta is not doing what's right by climate change. It's not being a responsible actor. And the shift now in how Alberta talks about climate change and oil production is incredible. And you've got their big oil majors saying, we want to price carbon. My answer, it should have happened ages ago. It should have happened years ago. It has happened to an extent, but not to a point that is responsible. So that's my first point, is that to be a pollution haven is very, very risky in this current world. That's what's called, in business terms, that's your goodwill. Alaska has a value, a goodwill. You do not want to vilify Alaskan oil. And there will be campaigns along the West Coast to keep Alaskan oil out of terminals or out of refineries, just the same as there is a campaign against Albertan oil to keep that out of those refineries and off the West Coast, like in BC. That's not good. It costs a lot of money. And Alberta could have used its remaining oil reserves to power up the transition to a better economy. And that's what Alaska can do. And I strongly advise that that be the case. It's also possible that Alaska's already paying a carbon price to refineries in California, because in California there's something called a clean fuel standard. And that applies to oil no matter where it comes from. And it penalizes the carbon content in your oil. Basically, the Californian regulators might actually be generating an income from Alaskan oil. And the argument goes, why don't you just put a price on it in Alaska, and then you don't have to pay it in California, and you guys get a revenue stream, and California doesn't have an excuse to penalize you because you've done what's right. That's what I mean by the pressures that are coming from elsewhere to Alaska to price carbon. It's a little worrying that they haven't played as big a role as they used to in this bloc, the Pacific Coast Collaborative that exists on the West Coast, where states are playing a role. And I believe that if there is a price that's set in all those jurisdictions, Alaska again will have to follow suit. It'll be vilified if not. And I wasn't joking when I said that Arnold Schwarzenegger put a lot of pressure on Governor Campbell. That pressure will start to come to the governor here. I'm told there's 10 minutes left, and I want to get some questions in. This is an interesting slide. It's just to say that places like Norway, who are big oil exporters, can price carbon. They did it in 1991. And the average is about $30 a ton. They built a monster sovereign fund, a bit like your permanent fund, except it's $1 trillion worth. They're at about $33 a ton on a ton of carbon. And what they've done is just factored in the social cost of carbon. It has a cost on our society. It's been estimated about 85. So many of the oil majors are already pricing it internally. And we need to sort of recognize the fact that BP says it'll price it at $80 a ton internally right now. Exxon does it at 60. So the Norwegians did it and got to 30. Their sovereign wealth fund is worth about $196,000 for each Norwegian. They have proposed putting a carbon tax on their offshore oil companies that increased to about £45 per ton. So they're not exempting the oil and gas industry. They're saying to them, you know that gas that you guys use, you're paying a tax on that. About 55% of its carbon-changing gases are taxed. And for me, it's a proof that you can be a major oil exporter and a carbon pricer at the same time. They reinvest a lot of that income they generate from the carbon tax into efforts to reduce climate change elsewhere. Call it a salve for a guilty conscience. For me, it's a little bit more responsibility taking than some other jurisdictions. And they can go to Paris and involve themselves in the right conversations when they get there in November. And I fear for Alaska's ability to do that. Very lastly, because I do want to leave up time for questions and answers. There was a statement by Senator here, Senator Koblowski? Murkowski. Apologies. She's not happy with fee and dividend. She doesn't like it. And she says to Congress, rural Alaskans are going to get hammered if we price carbon because they're so dependent on fuel, especially diesel. Thankfully, the good folks over at the University of Alaska in Anchorage, a guy called Steve Colt, just came out with a study just in time for me to read just before I got to talk to you. And the results are pretty amazing. It actually proves that if you set a fee and then you provide those dividends back to each Alaskan, and you give a rising proportion to those who are low income and have big families and live in rural parts of Alaska, and you give less of the dividends to folks who are single and love to fly to the Caribbean and probably can afford to pay a fee on carbon, it turns out that rural households in places like, and again, apologies for my pronunciation, Bethel, B-E-T-H-E-L, in the first year, they would pay out $515 in fees if they had 2 adults, 2 kids, but they'd take back $849 in a dividend. They'd actually make $334 in the first year if there was a fee and dividend. That's a national fee and dividend. Same in Kosovac. A large household, 2 kids, 2 adults, would take $400 back. And like I said, the exception are the single householders who like to fly a lot and use more carbon, and they'll probably break even. So don't believe it. A fee and a dividend does not take money away from rural Alaskans. It actually provides them some money back. I'm going to close with this. Who said, "I love that smell of the emissions," 2011? Does anybody know? Put up your hand if you know. Sarah Palin. She was at a motorcycle gathering. Who said, "The impacts of climate change in Alaska are already occurring: coastal erosion, increased storm effects, sea ice retreat, and permafrost melt" in 2008? A very responsible, very accurate, and slightly scary statement about climate impacts. Who said that? Sarah Palin. Illustrates a point that I feel that we're not quite at the point where people can say climate change is real, do something about it because it's costing us Alaskans a fortune. I think that day is just around the corner. I think we'll get to a day when someone like Sarah Palin cannot afford ever, politically ever, to say she loves the smell of the emissions, because that's my nieces and nephews' future she's taken away. On that note, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about some of the stuff I said today. 5 minutes, I'm sorry, but I will be around for the whole of the night, so it's just 5 minutes on air, and there's lots more after that. Any questions?
Can you remove her from the screen?
Yo, okay, there's a button for that. Yeah, there is, if you can, yeah, please. There's a mic, yeah, because it's otherwise, or I can repeat your question back. It's one or the other. That was a lot of information I fired at you.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was going to say. It is a lot, and there's a lot to take in, and I'll look forward to reading what Steve has to say about rural Alaska and costs there, because I have spent quite a bit of time out in the Arctic and in a lot of the villages in Alaska, and it is true that it's very low income in many of the places. So taxing and dividend return might be quite nice, but coming up with that money in the first place is a difficult thing. But one of the questions I have is, in British Columbia, the taxing scheme sounds really great. How does it work for a project such as oil sands that are going on? Where does the tax come in, and then how does the dividend work for a project like that that is doing some massive degradation to the environment?
Yeah, so the only time that tar sands oil touches soil in BC is in a pipe, and it actually gets mined in northern Alberta. But northern Alberta does have a pricing scheme. They took the dodgy, I call it dodgy, it's a dodgy approach to using emissions rating. So you don't cap anything. You basically set a target, an intensity target for industry, and you say each barrel of oil you produce has to be at that level of intensity. And if you can't get to that level of intensity, you can just go ahead and buy some offsets. I struggle with that. It hasn't worked in any degree to either rein back tar sands production or Alberta's per person contribution to climate change. For a comparison, it's well over, I think, 60 tons per person. So they are creating a huge amount of climate change. So the answer is that it's an intensity target that they've tried to introduce, and it hasn't worked. It really hasn't worked. Any other questions? Yeah, use the mic if you could. Or I can repeat your...
Yeah, I'm just wondering, with all the massive forest fires and all the climate change events that are escalating and very visible in the United States as well as Canada, especially this summer, is there any way of making the public more aware and tying in this idea, not on a financial way, but somehow tying in the the climate change that more and more people are witnessing in their hometowns and or with people they love. More and more houses are burning in the States, just read the newspaper. And could that kind of information be tied in with this in any kind of a productive way to help?
Yeah.
This is, I know for my part, as a college-educated person, I still have a hard time grasping the economic concepts.
Yeah.
But I can certainly grasp the climate change concepts.
Yeah, so a big effort
Can we
is...
make it simpler for the average person, I guess, is the question.
My answer is it's up to you. And honestly, that's the grassroots mobilization we need, is each person telling their family, their friends, challenging people who don't want to hear it, that climate change is here. It's in the shape of runaway forest fires, communities being relocated, permafrost issues, whatever it is. It takes person-to-person communication on this is climate change and we need to do something about it. I understand the level of denial or apprehension about the issue, but the longer we wait, the worse it gets. Unless there's one other question, I think we may be just about out of time. We have about 1 minute.
Briefly, could you address how British Columbia has factored in carbon trading?
So there was a component of carbon trading in the scheme. We were to be part of the Western Climate Initiative trading that's going on with California. The gas industry in BC nixed it and said it wasn't going to be competitive if there was that scheme. Bizarrely though, they are part of the carbon taxing scheme. So we didn't go that way. We didn't go that direction. We set about taxing it and returning the revenue straight back to corporations or British Columbians. Other jurisdictions have chosen the cap and trade scheme. What's good about the cap and trade scheme is it sets an overall emission level that you can put permits out to, and then it can be reduced every single year. Either way it works. Pricing carbon, I'm agnostic as to whether it's cap and trade or carbon tax. My experience with carbon tax is it's simple, it's understandable. If you call it a fee and a dividend, then you don't get the big anti-tax pushback. So go for it. Bring it on. All right, I think that's probably going to wrap us up this evening. The cameraman's nodding at me. Thank you so much for listening.
That was Owen Madden in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with 360 North. It was recorded September 15, 2015 at 360 in Juneau. With support from GCI, Alaska Electric Light and Power Company, Wastman and Associates Incorporated, Coeur Alaska Incorporated, Hecla Greens Creek Mining Company, Sea Alaska, and Alaska Power and Telephone.